The brake on the supply wagon screamed like a dying rabbit, cutting through the gray silence of the afternoon. Clara Whitmore waited. She did not move until the driver, a man named Zeke with eyes the color of dirty ice, spat a brown stream of tobacco onto the frozen mud. "This is it, ma'am. Redemption Gap. End of the line." He made no move to help her. He had barely spoken 2 words to her since Santa Fe, his disapproval a thick, sour blanket. Clara pushed back the stiff canvas flap and swung her legs over the side. Her boots hit the ground with a dull thud. The cold bit through the thin wool of her skirt instantly, sharp and personal. She stood alone in the main street, clutching the single rope handle of her satchel. The town was little more than a wound in the landscape, a collection of raw lumber and dirty adobe buildings huddled against the high desert wind. It was winter. The sky was a low, oppressive sheet of iron. The wind smelled of pine resin, coal dust, and the sharp tang of wood smoke. Her clothes were gray with trail dust, her face tight with a weariness that went bone deep. She had not slept truly, not in a bed, in weeks. She had not felt safe in years. As she stepped onto the boardwalk, the sound of her heels was too loud. A curtain twitched in the window of the mercantile. 2 men standing outside the land office stopped talking and just watched. Their eyes moved over her, cataloging the worn seams of her coat, the lack of a wedding ring on her chapped hand, the exhaustion that hung on her like a poor perfume. This was the looking. She knew the looking. It was the look given to a woman alone, a woman without protection, a woman who had, by her very presence, failed some unspoken test of decency. She tried the hotel first. It was called the Redemption Hotel. Its sign painted in hopeful, peeling gold letters. The lobby was warm and smelled of varnish and cigar smoke. A clerk with a thin mustache, Mr. Halloway, looked up from his ledger. "A room," Clara said. Her voice was hoarse. He looked past her, toward the street, as if searching for the man who belonged to her. Seeing no one, his expression settled into one of oily dismissal. "We're full up. Town's full. Railroad survey." Clara looked at the wall of keys behind him. More than half were hanging on their hooks. "I only need 1 night. I can pay." "Full up," he repeated, his voice flat. He turned back to his ledger. The conversation was over. She stood there for a moment, the warmth of the room stinging her cheeks. Then she turned and walked back out into the wind. She walked past the livery, past the squat stone bank, until she found the small, whitewashed building with a crooked cross on top. The church-run soup kitchen, a sign promised charity and bread for the godly poor. A stern woman in a black bombazine dress, Mrs. Gable, blocked the doorway before Clara could even step inside. The smell of boiling potatoes and weak broth drifted out, making Clara's stomach clench with a painful, hollow ache. "We're closing, ma'am," the woman said, though it was hours before dark. "Please," Clara whispered. "I haven't eaten today. I can work. I can sweep or wash." Mrs. Gable's eyes were small and hard. "This kitchen is for the decent folk of this town, for families hit by hardship." She looked Clara up and down, and her gaze was heavier than any man's. "We heard the wagon was bringing in company. We do not aid those who make bad choices. We do not encourage sin. Bad choices." The words echoed in Clara's mind as she turned away, the door clicking shut behind her. The cold felt absolute. Bad choices. Was that what it was called? She saw Kansas again. Just for a second. Green. So green it hurt to remember. She saw her father's face, tight with fire and brimstone, his disappointment a wall between them. He had wanted her to marry the banker's son, a boy with damp hands and a weak chin. And then she saw Miguel. He had not been a deserter to her. He had been a man with kind eyes and a soft voice, a soldier in a dusty blue uniform who had ridden north from Mexico with a horse, a rifle, and a deep weariness of killing. He had taught her 3 words in Spanish: "Te quiero, mi vida, Mateo." Mateo, their son, a beautiful boy with his father's dark eyes and her pale hair. The memory was sharp, like broken glass. Kansas had cast her out for marrying him, for loving a Mexican, for bearing his child. They had fled south, toward a new life. They had almost made it. Then the bandits, dust on the horizon, the crack of rifles, Miguel shouting for her to hide, to take the boy and run, the awful silence afterward, broken only by the laughter of men and the sound of her own screaming. Mateo hadn't survived the cold night that followed. Miguel hadn't survived the bullets. She had buried them both with her bare hands under a pile of stones in the desert. Bad choices. Clara shook the memory away. It was a luxury. Crying was a luxury. She was cold, and she was hungry, and the sun was falling. She kept walking, past the respectable part of town, toward the noise, the Silver Spur Saloon. It was the one place that did not pretend to be decent. It was loud, smelled of stale beer, frying fat, and unwashed men. She did not go to the Batwing doors. She went around the back, into the alley, past the frozen heaps of trash and splintered crates. The back door opened into a kitchen that was a cloud of steam, smoke, and curses. A huge, sweating man with a filthy apron, Murchison, was hacking at a side of beef with a cleaver. "What?" he barked, not looking up. "I need work," Clara said, projecting her voice over the din. "I can cook. I can clean. I'll do anything." Murchison stopped hacking. He looked at her. He, too, cataloged her. But his was a different kind of math. He wasn't measuring her soul. He was measuring her desperation. "Can you peel potatoes?" "Yes, sir." "Can you scrub a floor till it bleeds?" "Yes, sir." "Can you keep your mouth shut and your eyes down when the boys get loud?" Clara thought of Miguel. She thought of Mateo. She thought of the cold ground. "Yes, sir." 10 cents an hour. You start now." He pointed with the cleaver to a mountain of potatoes in the corner. "And you keep this kitchen clean. I won't have no filth." He paused. "You got a place to sleep?" "No, sir." He grunted. He jerked his chin toward a small, dark door. "Storeroom. There's sacks in there. Don't steal nothing. You steal, I break your hands. You start crying or making trouble, you're out. Understand?" "I understand." "Then get to it." He slammed the cleaver into the beef. Clara slipped off her coat, hung it on a nail, and put her satchel in the dark corner that would be her new home. The storeroom was windowless, cold, and smelled of burlap and mouse droppings. It was the most beautiful room she had ever seen. She picked up the paring knife, found a bucket, and sat on a low stool. Her hands were stiff, but she worked. The steady, rhythmic thunk of the knife against the potato was a comfort. It was work. It was survival. She learned the rhythm of the Silver Spur. The roar of the main room was muffled by the kitchen wall, but the smells were not. She scrubbed pots caked with grease until her knuckles were raw and bleeding. She peeled endless sacks of onions and potatoes, her eyes stinging, her back screaming. At night, Murchison would shove a plate of cold beans and gristle at her. She would eat it in the storeroom, curled on a pile of empty flour sacks, and fall asleep in seconds. She was invisible. The dance hall girls, with their bright paint and tired eyes, ignored her. The gamblers and drinkers never saw her. She was the gray woman who emptied the spittoons and scrubbed the floor. Days turned into a week, then 2. The winter deepened. Then he came. Eli Blackthorne lived in the canyons, in the places the white men called wastelands. He was a tall man, solitary, moving with a silence that was unsettling. He herded wild cattle, the half-starved mavericks that hid in the scrub, branding them with his own mark. A simple, single line. He spoke little and rarely came to town. When he did, the town watched him with a different kind of looking. Not the judgmental stare they gave Clara. This was fear, mixed with a deep, abiding scorn. Eli was half Apache. His story was told in whispers, a piece of frontier lore. His Apache mother, they said, had been the only survivor of a cavalry raid on a small camp. A white rancher, Blackthorn, had found her, used her, and kept her in a line shack until she bore his son. When the boy was old enough to be useful, Blackthorn tried to beat the Indian out of him. When he couldn't, he rejected him entirely. Eli grew up in no world at all. The Apache who remained saw him as a half-blood, the son of a white man. The white men saw him as a savage, the son of an Apache. He had learned one lesson early. Trust no one. Trust the wind. Trust the hawks. Trust the cold stone of the canyons. He lived alone in a half-collapsed adobe his father had abandoned. His only companions, the wind and the ghosts of his mother's people. Clara did not know this history, not yet. She only knew what she saw. It was a Tuesday, late afternoon. The saloon was quiet. Clara was wiping down the pass-through counter that connected the kitchen to the bar, her hands burning from the lye soap. The batwing doors swung open. The idle chatter in the room stopped. Clara froze. He was tall, taller than any man she had ever seen. He filled the doorway, blocking the weak gray light. He wore worn canvas trousers, sheepskin, and a heavy, old-looking military belt. His black hair was long, tied back with a leather strip, but one thick braid, woven with a single, faded red thread, rested on his shoulder. His face was hard, scarred, his cheekbones high, his eyes dark and still. He walked to the bar. He did not look at anyone. He just stood, waiting. His presence sucked the air from the room. Murchison, wiping a glass, nodded curtly. Blackthorn. Salt, Eli said. His voice was deep, rough from disuse, like stones grating together. Tobacco. Coffee. Got a new shipment of jerky, Murchison offered, his voice carefully neutral. Business was business. Eli shook his head, just once. Clara watched, hidden by the steam from the sink. She watched the way he stood, his back to the room, but aware of everything in it. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand rested near the knife on his belt. He was like a wolf that had wandered into a chicken coop, not necessarily meaning harm, but capable of ending the world in a heartbeat. He was an outcast. She felt a strange, cold pull of recognition. He was the only other person she had seen who wore the same cloak of isolation she did. Murchison bagged the goods. Eli dropped a few coins on the bar, picked up his supplies, and turned to leave. That's when it happened. 3 cowhands were playing cards at a corner table. They were drunk early, bored, and mean. Their names were Jed, Silas, and a young one called Pete. "Smell that, boys?" Jed said, loud enough to carry. He was a big man with a wet, drooping mustache. "Smells like smoke and damp leather." Silas snickered. "Nah, that ain't leather. That's just Blackthorn. Half-breed smells like what he is." Eli stopped. He did not turn, but his whole body went rigid. Clara held her breath. The kitchen was suddenly too hot. Jed, emboldened by the whiskey and Eli's stillness, pushed his chair back. "Heard his ma was one of them Apache women. The friendly kind, if you catch my meaning." "Friendly?" Silas laughed, a high, ugly sound. "Heard she was just a camp follower. Walked right into the soldiers' camp, traded favors for whiskey and blankets." It was a lie, a cruel branding meant to hurt. It was the same poison Mrs. Gable had spat at Clara. Bad choices, sin, company. Eli's hand, scarred and brown, slowly clenched into a fist at his side. He was breathing. Clara could see the slow rise and fall of his broad back. He was waiting. He was deciding whether to kill them or to walk away. Clara looked at the men, their faces flushed with cheap power and drink. She looked at the coiled, silent pain of the man at the door. She felt a sudden, hot spike of anger, not fear, but pure, clean anger. She moved before she could think. She grabbed a heavy iron skillet from the stove, her hand wrapped in her apron. She walked straight out of the kitchen, past Eli, and toward the men's table. They looked up, surprised to see the kitchen woman. Clara's heart was hammering so hard she thought it would break her ribs. She kept her eyes low, humble. She stopped at their table. "Mr. Murchison needs help. Jed," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "That new keg of beer in the cellar. He said it's too heavy for him. Said you were the only one strong enough to shift it without breaking your back." Jed blinked. The train of his insult was broken. He was being called strong. He looked from Clara to Eli, confused. Silas scoffed. "We're busy, woman." "He said he'd pay," Clara lied, her eyes still on the table. "Said he'd knock $1 off your tally." That did it. $1 was $1. Jed shoved his chair back, his pride salvaged. "Well, if he needs the help," he grumbled. But he stood. "Come on, Pete. Let's show the old man how it's done." Silas, left alone, glared at Clara, then at Eli's back. But the moment was gone. The violence had been diffused. He spat on the floor and threw his cards down. Clara turned to go back to the kitchen. Her legs were shaking. She had risked her job, her safety, her tiny place in this world. As she reached the kitchen doorway, she had to pass him. Eli Blackthorne had not moved. He was still standing, facing the main doors. But as she passed, he turned his head. His dark eyes met hers. There was no smile. There was no nod. There was nothing soft in his face. But he looked at her. He saw her. It lasted only a second. It was a look of pure, heavy acknowledgement. It was the silent, startled gratitude of a creature who had expected a blow and received, instead, a shield. Then he was gone. The batwing door swung shut, and the cold draft he left behind was the only sign he had been there at all. Clara leaned against the doorframe, the heavy skillet suddenly weighing 1,000 pounds. Murchison stormed into the kitchen. "What in the hell do you think you're doing, woman? And what's this about a keg?"
"They were bothering the customers, sir,"
Clara said, her voice trembling.
"I thought it was bad for business."
Murchison stared at her. He looked at the half-empty saloon, then back at her. He grunted. "You're lucky they didn't wrap that skillet around your head. Get back to the damn potatoes." He walked away. Clara went back to the sink, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the soap. She had made an enemy of Silas and Jed, but she didn't care. She kept seeing that look, the look of a man who had been alone for so long. He had forgotten what it was to be seen. She knew that look. She saw it in her own cracked reflection every morning. The cold did not come slowly. It arrived like an axe blade, splitting the gray sky and sending a wind down from the northern mountains that had the taste of iron and ice. The town of Redemption Gap hunched into itself. Men who had boasted of riding through blizzards now stayed close to the Silver Spur's pot-bellied stove. The wind howled, a high, thin scream that never stopped, day or night. It found every crack in Clara's storeroom. The damp cold of the earthen floor seemed to crawl up the pile of burlap sacks where she slept. It seeped into her bones, a permanent chill that no amount of work could burn away. She worked from before dawn until long after midnight. Her hands plunged alternately in scalding, greasy water and buckets of icy rinse water. They were cracked and bleeding, the skin drawn tight over her knuckles. Murchison, foul-tempered from the lack of customers, drove her harder. "The floor, woman! Scrub it again! You call that clean?" Jed and Silas, trapped indoors by the weather, took their boredom out on her. They would accidentally spill a full spittoon near her, or drop a mug of beer, just to watch her kneel and clean it up. "Look at her," Silas would mutter, just loud enough for her to hear. "Scrubbing the floor, right where she belongs." Clara said nothing. She kept her eyes down. She scrubbed, she peeled, she hauled wood, and she began to cough. It started as a dry tickle, a scratching in her chest. She blamed the wood smoke and the dust. Then the cough became wet, a deep, rattling sound that shook her thin frame. She would press her apron to her mouth, stifling the sound. Terrified Murchison would hear. Sickness was weakness, and weakness meant being cast out. One night, alone in the freezing darkness of the storeroom, a coughing fit seized her. It was violent, unstoppable. It left her breathless, doubled over. When she pulled her hand away from her mouth, she felt a damp warmth. She stared at her palm in the sliver of moonlight coming under the door. It was dark, blood. A cold, sharp terror, colder than the wind, pierced her. She had seen this before. On the trail, consumption, pneumonia, whatever the name, it was a death sentence. She tried to work the next day. The saloon was a blur of smoke, noise, and heat that made her skin prickle. Her lungs felt full of wet gravel. Every breath was a fight. She dropped a stack of plates, and Murchison's roar seemed to come from a great distance.
"You get out! Get out of my kitchen, you clumsy! Just get out!"
She did not remember him firing her. She only knew she had to get air. The saloon was suffocating. She stumbled through the back door into the alley. The storm hit her like a physical blow. The wind tore the breath from her lungs, replacing it with the needles of ice. Snow was falling so thickly she could not see the building across the street. She leaned against the rough wooden wall, trying to breathe. The world tilted. The high, screaming wind was the only sound. Mateo, she thought, her mind fogged with fever. So cold. No one helped. No one saw. The saloon door stayed shut. A rectangle of yellow light and muffled noise. She slid down the wall, the snow piling up around her legs instantly. She was too tired to shiver. The cold was almost a comfort, a heavy blanket numbing the pain in her chest. She closed her eyes. The darkness was soft and quiet. Eli Blackthorne had not meant to come to town. The storm was bad, the kind that killed cattle and sealed the canyons for a month. But he was low on coffee, and his last bag of salt had split. A man could live without coffee, but livestock needed salt. He rode his tough mountain pony through the white chaos, his face wrapped in a wool scarf, his hat pulled low. He moved like a shadow, keeping to the back alleys, avoiding the main street. He hated the town. He hated the eyes, the whispers, the smell of it. He tied his horse to the hitching post behind the saloon, the only place that offered a little cover from the wind. He was fastening the knot when he saw it. A dark shape, half buried in a snowdrift against the saloon wall. His first thought was, drunk. A cowhand passed out. He almost turned away. It was not his business. The town and its people could die for all he cared. But the shape was too small, too still. He moved closer, his boots silent in the deep snow. He saw the edge of a gray wool skirt, the pale, chapped hand. He saw the dark hair, dusted with white. It was the kitchen woman, the one who had stepped in front of the bullets meant for him. He knelt. Her face was pale as porcelain, her lips blue. A small, dark stain of frozen blood was smeared at the corner of her mouth. He put his bare, scarred fingers to her neck. A pulse, faint, thready, like a moth trapped in ice, but it was there. He looked at the saloon door. He could bang on it. He could shout, "Bring Murchison, bring the dance hall girls." They would look at her. They would whisper. They would likely drag her inside, lay her on the floor by the stove, and watch her die. Their judgment a final, suffocating blanket. They would say it was her own fault. He looked down at her face. He saw the lines of exhaustion, the hollows under her eyes. He remembered her voice, quiet and steady, cutting through the hatred. "He said you were the only one strong enough." He made his decision in that heartbeat. It was not a choice. It was a debt. Without a word, he unhooked his bedroll from his saddle. He shook out the heavy oilcloth and the thick buffalo hide. He slid his arms under her body. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of sticks and wet wool, and lifted her. He wrapped her tightly in the furs, then the oilcloth, cocooning her against the storm. He mounted his horse, settling her in front of him, her head lolling against his chest. He wrapped his own arms around her, pulling his sheepskin coat over her as best he could, lending his body's heat. He turned the horse not toward the main street, but away, into the teeth of the wind, into the white, howling dark of the canyonlands. The ride was a blur of white agony. The world was reduced to the space between his horse's ears. The wind tried to peel him from the saddle, to steal the small bundle of life he held. The horse stumbled in drifts, fighting for every step. Eli did not feel the cold. He focused on a single point, the small flicker of breath he felt against his ribs. He kept his arm clamped tight, his own body a shield against the ice. It seemed like a lifetime. The canyon walls rose around them, unseen in the blizzard, but he knew them by heart. He knew every rock, every turn. He rode by instinct, by the memory of the land, until finally, the horse stopped, its sides heaving, outside the low, dark shape of his cabin. He carried her inside. The cabin was one room, built of stone and failing adobe. It was cold, the fire long dead. He did not lay her down. He held her as he worked, his movements economical and swift. He kicked the hearth clear, used his flint and steel on the tinder he kept dry in a box. A spark caught. He blew it to life, adding kindling, then larger logs. Only when the fire was blazing, casting a low orange light, did he lay her down on his own bed. It was a simple cot, built into the wall, layered with furs and clean blankets. He unwrapped the frozen oilcloth, pulling the stiff, icy layers away from her. He worked with an impersonal efficiency, as if handling a half-frozen calf. He pulled off her wet boots, her sodden coat, her dress. He did not pause, his face hard and set. He left her in her thin chemise, pulled the heavy furs up to her chin, and tucked them tightly around her. He spent the next hour tending the fire and the pot. He melted snow for water, added dried herbs, jerky, and a handful of wild onions. A thin, savory stew began to bubble. Clara woke to two sensations, warmth and pain. The warmth was a miracle. It was deep, heavy, and smelled of wood smoke and fur. The pain was in her chest, a hot, sharp spike every time she tried to breathe. She was floating in a fever dream. She thought she was dead, but dead was cold. She had buried cold. This was something else. Her eyes cracked open. The world was blurry, orange and brown. A low fire crackled in a stone hearth. The ceiling was made of rough-hewn logs. She was under a mountain of furs, so heavy she could barely move. A figure sat by the fire, his back to her, tall, broad, and utterly still. He was stirring a black pot that hung over the flames. She tried to speak. A dry, painful cough tore out of her. The man turned. It was him, the half-Apache Blackthorn. His face was shadowed, unreadable. He rose, not quickly, but with a deliberate silence. He dipped a tin cup into a bucket of water and walked to the bedside. He did not speak. He slid one arm under her head and lifted her. The movement was awkward, not gentle, but strong. She was too weak to resist. He held the cup to her cracked lips. "Drink," he commanded. The single word was rough, like scraping rock. She drank. The water was icy cold and tasted of tin, but it was life. She coughed, choking, but he held her steady until she had swallowed. Then he laid her back down, his expression unchanging. He pulled the furs back up to her chin. She licked her lips. Her mind was a fog, but one question burned through.
Why?
Her voice was a broken whisper.
Why? Help me.
Eli Blackthorn stared at her for a moment. His dark eyes were impossible to read. They held no pity, no kindness. They just watched. He turned his back on her. He went back to the fire. He picked up the iron poker and jabbed at a log, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The sound of the poker against the wood was his only answer. The next few days were a blur. The storm howled outside, a constant shrieking reminder of the white wilderness that had nearly claimed her. The cabin was their world. It was sparse, almost bare. A rough table, 2 stools, the bed, and the hearth. Pegs on the wall held his saddle, his rifle, and his sparse gear. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness. The fever burned her, then left her in a pool of icy sweat. The pain in her lungs was a constant fire, but through the fog, there was always him. He was a silent presence. He never spoke, unless it was a single word. Drink, eat. He would wake her, lifting her head to press a cup of water or a tin bowl of thin, hot broth to her lips. She had no strength to argue. She swallowed. He slept by the fire. He had a bedroll of more furs, and he would sit there for hours, his back to her, staring into the flames. He seemed to be listening to the storm, as if it were a conversation only he could understand. One morning, her fever broke. She woke feeling weak, but her mind was clear. The cabin was quiet, lit by the gray light coming through the single, hide-covered window. The storm had passed. Eli was gone. She panicked, trying to sit up. The movement sent her into a fit of coughing. Weaker this time, but still painful. The door opened. He came in, his arms full of firewood, a dusting of fresh snow on his shoulders. He stopped when he saw her awake and watching him. They stared at each other for a long moment. He dropped the wood by the hearth, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. He pointed to a small tin on the stool beside her bed. Next to it were several strips of clean, white cloth. "Your hands," he said. Clara looked down. Her hands, resting on top of the furs, were a mess. The skin was cracked open and raw from the lye soap and the cold. He had brought her bandages and a salve that smelled sharply of pine resin and tallow. He had put them there while she slept. She looked at him, her throat tight. "Thank you," he grunted, turning his attention to the fire. The days settled into a new rhythm, a quiet rhythm. Clara was still too weak to leave the bed, but she could sit up, propped against the stone wall. He would tend his gear, his movements economical. He sharpened his knife until the blade gleamed. He mended a tear in his leather chaps with a needle and sinew. And Clara watched. She learned his silence. It was not an empty silence. It was full. It was the silence of the canyons, of the hawks. It was the silence of a man who had been alone so long. Words had become unnecessary. He let her rest in his bed. He never made any move to suggest she should leave, or that she was a burden. He simply existed, and he allowed her to exist in the same space. It was the deepest kindness she had ever known. One afternoon, he was outside, tending his horse in the small, lean-to stable. Clara felt a fragile surge of strength. She pushed the furs aside and stood, her legs trembling. She held on to the wall, taking one slow step, then another. She looked around the small cabin, truly seeing it for the first. It was his home. It was as sparse as he was. There were no pictures, no comforts, just tools and survival. Then she saw it, hanging from a wooden peg near his bed. Tucked half-hidden behind a stirrup was a small, beaded pouch. It was old, the leather dark and supple with age. The beadwork a faded pattern of blue and white. It was Apache. She felt a pull. She knew she should not. It was his. It was private. But her fingers moved, seemingly of their own will. She reached out and touched the soft leather. It was a connection to the part of him that the town hated, the part of him he kept hidden. She was holding it in her hands when the door opened. Eli stood there. He had a dead rabbit in one hand. He saw her, saw what she was holding. His face changed. The stillness vanished, replaced by a cold, dangerous flatness. His eyes went from her face to the pouch. He said nothing, but the air in the cabin became heavy, sharp as glass. Clara froze. She expected him to yell, to snatch it from her. She felt the blood drain from her face.
I am sorry,
she whispered, her voice shaking.
I should not have.
She held it out to him, an offering of peace. He did not take it. He just stood there, his eyes locked on the pouch, his knuckles white on the rabbit he held. He was breathing, a slow, controlled breath through his nose. Clara, trembling, looked down at the pouch in her own hands. She opened her palm, and a few items spilled from it. A single blue feather, a smooth, river-polished white stone, and a small, crude carving of a hawk, its wings spread. Remnants, the only things left of his mother, of his heritage. She looked up at him, her eyes filling with tears. She did not see a savage. She saw a man, holding onto the wreckage of his past with both hands. He watched her. He watched the tears trace a path through the grime on her cheeks. He saw her hands, gentle on the objects. He saw she was not curious. She was not disgusted. She was sad. He looked away. He turned, walked to the table, and threw the rabbit down. He took a long time wiping his skinning knife on a cloth. He did not look at her again. But he had not taken the pouch. He was allowing her to hold it. Her hands were shaking. She carefully, reverently, put the stone, the feather, and the carving back inside. She pulled the drawstring tight and hung the pouch back on its peg. A silent threshold had been crossed. He had seen her touch the most hidden part of him, and he had not struck. That evening, he handed her a bowl of stew, thick with rabbit meat. Their fingers brushed as she took it. Neither of them flinched. The blizzard had passed, leaving the world outside buried in a deep, brilliant and blinding white. The wilderness was quiet, resting under the snow. Inside the small cabin, the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of two strangers trapped by a storm. It was softer. It was the silence of two creatures in a burrow, sharing the same small pocket of warmth, waiting for the spring. The world was white and silent. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a sky so clear and blue it hurt the eyes. The snow was a thick, clean blanket, yards deep in the drifts, smoothing the harsh lines of the canyons into soft, rolling waves. Inside the cabin, the air was warm. Clara was folding the heavy buffalo hides on his bed, her movements slow, but sure. The cough was still there, a dry echo in her chest, but the fever was gone. The broth and the rest had done their work. She was weak, but she was alive. She looked at Eli. He was standing by the open door, staring out at the blinding light, a silhouette against the snow. He had given her his bed, his food, his shelter. He had saved her life, and she was a weight he should not have to bear.
The storm is over,
she said, her voice quiet but clear in the stillness. He did not turn. It is. I have taken your bed long enough. I am strong enough to walk back. He turned then, just his head. He looked at her thin dress, her worn-out boots, and then back at the snow outside. You would not make it past the first ridge. The snow is deep. There are drifts higher than this cabin. I cannot stay here. Mr. Blackthorne, I am an intrusion. He looked at her for a long time. She felt the weight of his gaze, dark and unreadable. He was weighing her, measuring her resolve. He saw the shame in her eyes, the stubborn pride. He had seen it in the saloon. I will ride you back, he said. It was not an offer. It was a statement of fact. He turned and went outside to dig his horse out of the lean-to. An hour later, they were ready. The air was so cold it felt like breathing in splinters of glass. Eli brought the horse to the door. It was a tough, shaggy pony, its breath pluming in the air. He mounted first, then reached down a scarred, gloved hand. Clara hesitated. She looked at his hand, then at the cabin that had been her sanctuary. She put her hand in his. His grip was like iron. He pulled her up easily, settling her behind him, her skirts bunched around her. Hold on, he said. She put her hands lightly on his waist. She could feel the hard muscle of his back, the warmth of his body through the thick sheepskin coat. He clicked his tongue and the horse moved, stepping carefully into the unbroken snow. The ride was slow. The horse labored, lifting its legs high, its body steaming with effort. The world was beautiful, a perfect, untouched white. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch thud of the horse's hooves and the jingle of the harness. Clara kept her hands on his waist, her face turned aside to avoid the wind. She felt the tension in him. He was a creature of these canyons, but now he was returning to the world that hated him, and he was bringing her with him. They rode for nearly 2 hours, following the high ridge where the snow was thinner. Clara had been so lost in the storm, she had not known how far he had taken her. They came around a sharp bend of red rock, and Eli suddenly pulled the horse to a halt. "What is it?" Clara asked. He did not answer. He was staring down into a small, sheltered bowl of land below them. Clara leaned to the side to see what he saw. It was a clearing, or it had been. Now, it was a place of black scars against the white snow. Tall, thin skeletons of burned lodgepoles pointed at the sky like accusing fingers. Patches of blackened ground showed where the snow had melted and refrozen over hot ash. A dark, frozen shape that might have been a hide was snagged on a broken branch. Half buried in a drift, stark and terrible, was a wooden cradleboard, its carving scorched, its leather ties stiff and empty. Clara felt the breath catch in her throat. It was the remnant of an Apache camp, a place where people had lived, a place that had been attacked, burned. Eli's body went rigid. Clara could feel the change in him, as if he had turned to stone. His hands, holding the reins, were clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. He did not breathe. He just stared, his face a mask of such cold, profound grief it was worse than any rage. This was not just a sight to him. It was a memory. It was the story of his mother, of his life, written in ash and snow. He said nothing. Clara said nothing. She did not ask. She did not touch him. She just sat quietly, her hands resting on him, a silent witness to his silent pain. She felt a tear freeze on her cheek. After a long time, a hawk cried, high and thin, far above them. Eli pulled his gaze away from the ruined camp. He nudged the horse forward, his back straight, his face turned toward the town. He did not speak again. They arrived in Redemption Gap in the weak light of the afternoon. The town looked dirtier than she remembered. The snow on the main street churned to a brown, frozen slurry. Eli stopped the horse in front of the Silver Spur Saloon. He did not go to the alley. He stopped in the main street, for all the world to see. He slid off the horse, then turned and held his arms up for her. Clara put her hands on his shoulders and he lowered her to the ground. Her legs were stiff and weak. She stumbled, and he caught her elbow, his grip steadying her. "Mr. Blackthorne," she began. "I cannot thank you." He just nodded. He did not look at her. He looked at the saloon, his eyes hard. A man walking by, Mr. Halloway from the hotel, stopped. He stared at them. He saw Eli Blackthorne, the half-breed, letting a white woman down from his horse. His eyes widened, and his mouth tightened in a thin line of disgust. He hurried on, his purpose clear. "Go," Eli said, his voice low. Clara nodded. She pulled her thin coat tighter and walked toward the back, toward the kitchen entrance. Eli did not leave. He stayed by his horse, watching. She pushed open the kitchen door. The smell of stale beer and frying fat hit her. Murchison was at the chopping block, a cigarillo clamped in his teeth. "So," he grunted, not looking up, "you ain't dead." "No, sir, I was sick. The storm." "I heard where you was." Clara froze. "Sir?" Murchison slammed his cleaver down. He turned, his face red. "I run a business here, a decent business, or as decent as it gets. I can't have my help. Consorting." "Consorting? I was sick. He saved my life."
He's an Indian. Woman! And you were alone with him? In his cabin? For days. He spat the words. Jed saw him ride out with you. The whole town knows.
I did nothing wrong.
It don't matter what you did, Murchison shouted. It matters what it looks like. It matters what people say. I already got Mrs. Gable from the church in here, telling me she's gonna have the marshals shut me down if I'm running a house of ill repute.
That is not what happened.
I don't care. It's bad for business. You're fired. Get your things.
My things?
Clara looked at the dark storeroom.
I have nothing.
Then get out.
He turned back to his chopping block.
Get out, before I have you thrown out.
Clara stood there, the heat of the kitchen stinging her eyes. She felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her cold and lightheaded. Fired. She had nothing. She had nowhere. She turned, her movements stiff, and walked out of the kitchen. She stepped from the alley onto the boardwalk of the main street. Mrs. Gable was there. She was not alone. 2 other women from the town's decent circle were with her, their faces pinched with righteous cold. They had been waiting.
There she is,
Mrs. Gable said, her voice carrying in the cold air. Clara tried to walk past them, her eyes down.
Shameless,
one of the other women hissed.
Going off with a savage, living in sin.
She always had a bad look about her, Mrs. Gable said, stepping to block Clara's path. I knew it the first time I saw her. The devil finds his own. She's poison, that one. A temptress. Clara stopped. She looked at their faces, hard, merciless, and clean. They were judges, and they had passed their sentence.
Please,
Clara whispered. Let me pass. Mrs. Gable looked at Clara's worn boots. Her lip curled. She gathered herself and spat on the wooden planks, just an inch from Clara's foot. The glob of saliva steamed in the freezing air. It was the final act. She was not just fired. She was banished. She was less than the dirt on their shoes. A hot, burning shame filled Clara's chest, hotter than any fever. It was so heavy she could not breathe. Tears welled, blurring the hard faces of the women, blurring the ugly street. She stumbled away from them, walking blindly, not caring where she was going. And then she looked up. Across the street, still mounted on his horse, Eli Blackthorne watched. He had seen it all. He had seen her walk out. He had seen the women. He had seen the spit. His face was granite. It was a mask of cold. Pure fury, so intense it was frightening. His hand was on the grip of the rifle in his saddle scabbard. He was watching Mrs. Gable, and his eyes were the eyes of a wolf deciding which throat to take first. Their eyes met across the street. Clara saw his rage. It was a rage for her, but she also saw the truth. It was because of him. His kindness had cost her the last scrap of her life. He was poison, and now she was, too. She broke his gaze. She could not bear it. She turned and walked away, past the edge of town, past the last building, until she was just walking along the frozen wagon ruts, with nowhere to go. She heard a horse's movement. She looked back. Eli was still there, watching her go. He watched until she was a small, dark figure in the snow. Then he yanked his horse's head around and rode hard, not toward her, but back to the canyons, kicking up plumes of snow and mud. He was gone. Dusk fell. The cold came back, seeping into her bones. Clara found herself sitting on a pile of frozen lumber behind the dark mercantile, shivering. She had walked until her legs gave out. Now, she was just waiting. She had no plan. She could not go back to the saloon. She could not go to the hotel. She could not go to the church. She could die here, frozen, behind the trash. It would be a quiet end. It would be easy. She thought of Miguel. She thought of Mateo. She had not survived them just to die of spite in a town called Redemption. Her anger, cold and quiet, began to burn. She stood up. She walked back through the alley, toward the one place she had known kindness, the church soup kitchen. It was dark, the door barred. But there was something on the bottom step. A bundle wrapped in rough brown cloth. Her heart stopped. She knelt, her fingers numb. She pulled the knot. Inside was a thick wool blanket, gray and rough. There was a half-dozen strips of dried jerky and a heavy, dense piece of cornbread wrapped in a rag. It was not a gift. It was survival. It was salt, tobacco, and coffee. It was him. He had left it for her. He had seen her shamed, seen her cast out, and he had left her supplies. It was his way of helping. It was his way of saying goodbye. He was giving her a chance to leave, to go somewhere else, to survive without him. Clara clutched the blanket. She buried her face in the rough wool. It smelled of wood smoke, of horses, and of him. She stood there in the dark alley for a long time. She looked east, toward the plains, toward Kansas, toward a life that no longer existed. She looked west, toward the black, rising shadows of the canyons. She could take this food and blanket and walk east. She would probably die. Or she could walk west. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. She held the food close to her chest, and she began to walk, following the deep, churned tracks his horse had left in the snow. It took hours. The moon was a sliver of ice. The tracks were hard to see. Her legs ached, and the cold was a living thing, clawing at her. But the anger and the cornbread gave her strength. She did not stop. When she finally saw the low, dark shape of his cabin, a single thread of orange smoke rising from the chimney, she was so tired she was weeping. She pushed the door open. He was there, sitting on the stool by the fire, his back to her, staring into the flames. He had not been sleeping. He had been waiting. He did not turn, but he stiffened. He had heard the door. He must have thought it was the wind. "Eli," she whispered. He spun around. He was on his feet in one motion, his hand grabbing for the knife on his belt. He saw her, standing in the doorway, wrapped in his blanket, her face pale as death, snow in her hair. His shock was absolute. He stared at her as if she were a ghost. He had left her the supplies to go, to be free of him, and she had come back. Clara stumbled inside, closing the door against the night. She was too tired to speak. She walked to the hearth, unwrapped the cornbread and jerky, and held them out to him. He just stared at the food. She did not wait. She took the pot, added water from the bucket, and placed the food inside. She found his small bag of beans and added a handful. She found his flour tin and began to mix a small bit of dough for dumplings. She was not a guest. She was not a burden. She was earning her keep. He watched her, his face a mask of confusion. He had seen the town cast her out. He had seen what they did to her, all because of him. And she had come here, to him. It was a madness he could not understand. He sat back down, heavily, and watched her cook. They ate in silence, sitting on the floor by the fire, the single oil lamp casting a low, orange glow. The stew was thin, but it was hot. The wind howled outside, but inside it was quiet. When they were done, Clara set the tin bowls aside. Eli was staring into the fire, his hat pulled low, casting his face in deep shadow. He looked trapped. She sat beside him, not touching, but close. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It was full. It was a shared thing. She looked at him, at the set of his shoulders, the worn lines of his hat. It was a barrier, a shield he wore even in his own home. Slowly, her hand shaking, she reached up. He tensed. He felt her hand rise, saw it in the corner of his eye. He did not move. Her cold fingers touched the stained brim of his hat. He held his breath. She gently, slowly, lifted the hat from his head and placed it on the floor beside them. His long, black hair, freed from the hat, fell around his shoulders. And there, stark against the black, was the single, thin braid, the Apache braid, the mark of his mother, the mark of the savage the town saw. He did not look at him. He lowered his head, his eyes fixed on the floor, his jaw tight. He was exposed. He had let her take his armor, and he was waiting for the blow. Her hand, still in the air, lowered. It rested on his shoulder, the rough wool of his shirt. He flinched, but did not pull away. Her fingers traced the line of his collarbone, then moved down, lightly, over his chest. She was not caressing him. She was just seeing him. Her hand stopped as her fingers brushed the heavy brass buckle of his belt. It was an old, wide belt, the leather dark and cracked, the buckle heavy and bearing an old military design. The instant her fingers touched the cold metal, heflinanche, it was not a small movement. It was a violent, full-body recoil, as if she had touched him with a hot poker. His head snapped up, his eyes wide, his breath sucked in. He stared at her, a look of pure, animal panic in his eyes. Clara froze, her hand still on the buckle. She saw his fear. She saw the pain. This belt was a wall. It was a wound. It was something he could not bear to have touched. She could have asked, "What is this? Why?" She did not ask. Answering would mean remembering, and she would not make him do that. Instead, she looked at his face. She saw the panic, the loneliness, the deep, abiding ache of a man who had never been touched with kindness. She saw the man who had ridden into a blizzard for her, the man who had faced down her attackers, the man who had watched her be shamed, and who had left her the only thing he had to give: food. She leaned in, her face close to his. She did not try to kiss him. She just brought her warmth close to his. She whispered, the words so quiet they were barely more than breath against his scarred cheek. "You deserve love." She laid her head gently against his shoulder. It was a simple weight, an offering of rest. Eli did not move. He didn't breathe. He sat rigid as stone, his eyes wide, staring into the fire. He did not put his arm around her. He did not push her away. He just sat there, trembling, as her words echoed in the silence of the cabin. He did not move for a long, long time. That night, he slept on his bedroll by the fire, and he dreamed. He had not let her words in. Not really. "You deserve love." He had sat, frozen, until she had finally, gently, moved away from him and laid down on his cot, turning her back, giving him the privacy of his own shock. But the words had been planted, and in the thin, vulnerable soil of his sleep, they sprouted, watered by memory. He was a boy, small, hiding in the reeds by a river. He saw them, blue-coated soldiers, their faces red with sun and whiskey, riding into his mother's camp. They were loud. He heard a laugh, then a scream. He saw them drag his mother from the wickiup, her black hair undone, her hands fighting. He saw her face, just for a second, turned toward the reeds, her eyes wide with a terror that said, "Run!" The dream shifted. The reeds were gone. He was older, perhaps 10, standing outside a whitewashed ranch house. His father, Amos Blackthorne, stood on the porch, a tall, cold man with pale eyes. He was holding the boy's arm, his fingers digging in. "You are not my son," his father's voice said, flat and final. "You are her whelp. Get off my land." He turned and walked inside, closing the heavy door. The click of the latch was as loud as a gunshot. The dream shifted again. He was 15, almost a man. He was working for a rancher named Henderson, branding calves. He had done nothing wrong, but a steer had broken free. Jed and Silas, younger then but just as mean, had cornered him behind the corral. Sloppy work, half-breed, then the fists. They held him down. They beat him. He tasted dust and his own blood. He felt the sharp, bright pain of a boot connecting with his ribs. He had not fought back. He had just endured. his eyes fixed on a hawk circling in the blue, empty sky. He woke with a gasp, his hand flying not to his knife, but to the heavy brass buckle of his belt. The cabin was gray with early light. The fire was low embers. He was sweating, though the air was freezing.
A small sound. Scrape, scrape, scrape.
He sat up, his heart hammering. Clara was not on the cot. She was on her feet, by the far wall. She had found a stiff, broken branch of willow and was using it to sweep the packed dirt floor. She had already tidied the hearth, stacking the remaining wood. She had taken one of the rags he used for cleaning his rifle and was wiping the dust from the small, rough table. She was bringing order to his world. He watched her. His breath caught in his chest. She moved with a quiet purpose, her body still weak, but her will strong. She was not a guest, cowering. She was a partner, working. She turned and saw him watching. She froze, the makeshift broom in her hand. A flush rose on her pale cheeks.
I could not sleep. The floor was dirty.
Eli said nothing. He pushed himself to his feet, grabbed his coat, and went outside into the biting cold to check his horse. The dream clung to him, a sour, cold film. Over the next few days, the cabin changed. Clara was relentless, but quiet. She did not ask permission. She simply did. She found an old, cracked tin pot, scrubbed it with sand from the creek bed, and filled it with soil. In it, she planted a few dried, forgotten seeds she had found in a small pouch tucked high on a shelf, his mother's, though she did not know it. Wild squash and beans. She patched the drafty, hide-covered window with strips of cloth torn from her own petticoat. She found his small stash of soap and washed both his blankets and her own dress, hanging them by the fire to dry, filling the small room with the clean, sharp smell of lye. She was erasing the grime, the neglect, the solitude. She was sweeping out the ghosts. Eli watched. He did not help, and he did not stop her. He was baffled. He would go out for hours, checking his traps or scouting for cattle, and when he returned, a new, small piece of comfort would be in place. It was unsettling. He had built his life on the certainty that no one would ever stay, that nothing could ever be clean. She was proving him wrong with a broom and a sewing needle. One evening, they sat by the fire. She was mending a tear in his sheepskin coat. He was oiling his rifle, the lamplight gleaming on the barrel. The silence had become easy between them, a shared blanket. She finished her stitch and bit the thread. She set the coat down.
Eli,
she said, her voice soft, not looking at him. He grunted, his hand not stopping its circular motion with the oil rag.
That belt, she said, the one you wear.
His hand stopped. The cabin became utterly still, save for the crackle of the fire. He did not look at her. He just stared at the rifle in his lap. He remembered her fingers on the buckle, his own violent flinch. You never take it off, she said. It was not an accusation, just a fact. I asked you why you wear it. He did not move for a long time. The tension built, stretching thin, until Clara was afraid it would snap. She regretted speaking. She had pushed too far, touched the wound. He set the rifle down, very carefully. He stood. He walked to the fire, his back to her, and braced his hands on the rough stone of the hearth. He stared down into the flames. His broad back was a wall, hiding everything. She waited. The silence stretched for a full minute. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low, she almost missed it. It was a rough, gravelly sound, ripped from his throat. It was my father's. He said nothing more, but the three words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. His father, Amos Blackthorne, the man with the cold eyes who had turned him away. Clara looked at the belt. It was a cavalry belt. Old, from some war, it was the belt of a white soldier, a white rancher. It was not Apache. It was the symbol of the man who had rejected him. She understood. He wore his father's rejection. He wore his shame, his burden, his heritage, cinched tight around his waist like armor. It was his penance and his poison. She knew, without asking, that he had probably taken it from his father's dead body. He had put it on, a boy claiming a hateful inheritance, and had never found a way to take it off. That night, the cold deepened. A new front had moved in. Clara lay on the cot, shivering, pulling the furs tight. Eli lay on his bedroll by the fire, but the fire was low, and she could hear the wind whistling through the new patches on the window. She heard him shift, his teeth chattering softly.
Eli?
She whispered into the dark. He was instantly still. What?
You will freeze. You will be sick again.
She paused.
There is room on the floor. Here, away from the door. It is warmer.
She heard him breathing. She had offered him a place near her. It was a terrifying, intimate thing. After a long silence, she heard the rustle of his furs. He moved, dragging his bedroll across the floor. He did not get on the cot. He laid his bedroll on the floor, beside her cot. A foot of empty space separated them, but he was there, in the small alcove, sheltered by the stone wall. She could hear him breathe. He was so close. They lay like that, not speaking, in the cold, dark room. The next night, Clara, without a word, moved her own furs from the cot to the floor, laying them beside his, leaving just an inch of bare earth between them. He said nothing. They slept that way, side by side, not touching, but two small points of warmth against the vast, cold wilderness. The wall of silence began to crumble, stone by stone. One afternoon, he was sitting by the door, mending a broken trap, his strong, scarred hands working with surprising delicacy.
Found a hawk once,
he said, his voice quiet, directed at the trap. Clara stopped stirring the pot of bean soup she was making. She turned. He was not looking at her.
Its wing was broke,
he went on, his voice rough.
Smashed by a rockfall. It was just a young one. Should have died.
He described, in short, clipped sentences, how he had taken it in, how it had tried to rip his hand open, how he had built a splint for the wing from willow sticks and sinew, how he had fed it mice and bits of jerky. He talked about the day, months later. He had taken it to the canyon rim. He had undone the bandages, and the hawk had sat on his arm, its dark eyes watching him. Then it had opened its wings and leapt into the updraft, soaring away without a backward glance. It never came back, he finished. Clara stood, the spoon in her hand, her heart aching. He had given her a piece of himself, the most private, gentle piece. She sat down on the stool across from him.
I had a son,
she said, her voice just as quiet. His hands stilled on the trap. He did not look up, but he was listening. His name was Mateo. He had his father's eyes, dark and kind. She told him about the long journey from Kansas. She told him about the bandits and the long night that followed. It was not the bandits that took him. It was the cold, a fever. He died in my arms, and he was so small. She had not spoken of this to anyone. She had buried Mateo with her own hands, and buried the words with him. Eli looked up. His dark eyes met hers. He did not offer comfort. He did not say he was sorry. He just looked at her, and his gaze was one of perfect, shared understanding. He knew what it was to lose. He knew what it was to be alone with a ghost. They sat in the quiet, their shared wounds exposed to the firelight. It was a bond, deeper than any touch. The peace was shattered by a sound. Bang! 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 Someone was pounding on the cabin door. It was not a knock. It was a blow, meant to break it down. Eli was on his feet in less than a second. He did not reach for his rifle. He grabbed the skinning knife from the table. His body coiled, his face instantly reverting to the hard, cold mask of the canyons. "Stay back," he whispered. Clara shrank against the far wall, her heart seizing.
Bang! Bang! Open up, Blackthorn! We know she's in there!
It was Jed's voice. Eli moved to the door. He did not open it.
Go away. We ain't going nowhere. We got business with the woman. Open this door, or we'll burn it down.
Eli looked at Clara. Her face was white with terror. He took a breath, unbarred the door, and pulled it open just a crack, his body blocking the opening. 3 men stood outside, Jed and Silas, their faces mean in the torchlight, and with them, a third man, a large, heavy-set man in a thick wool coat. It was Henderson, the rancher whose men had beaten Eli as a boy. "Blackthorn," Henderson said, his voice a low growl. He pushed the door, forcing Eli to step back. The 3 men crowded into the small cabin. Their cold, wet presence filled the room. "What do you want?" Eli said. It was not a question. "We want the woman," Henderson said, his eyes finding Clara. "She's a thief."
What?
Clara's voice was a squeak. "Murchison. He says a side of bacon and 2 bottles of whiskey went missing the day you left. Said you were the only one who had access to the storeroom."
That's a lie,
Clara cried.
I took nothing.
"And," Henderson said, his eyes sweeping the cabin, taking in the cot, the furs, the shared space. "You're living here, in sin, with him." He jerked his chin at Eli, his lip curling with contempt. "We're taking you back to town. The marshal can sort it out." "She's not going anywhere," Eli said. His voice was dangerously quiet. Henderson laughed, a short, ugly bark. "You don't have a say, savage. This is a white town. We're taking her." He took a step toward Clara. Jed and Silas fanned out, their hands on the pistols at their belts. "Stand aside, Blackthorn. This ain't your concern." Eli did not move. He was a stone wall. Henderson's patience snapped. He lunged for Clara, grabbing her arm. "Come on, woman, we're done talking." He yanked her hard. Clara screamed. "Let her go," Eli said. His voice was a vibration, a sound from the earth. "Or what?" Henderson sneered, pulling Clara toward the door.
You'll scalp us?
That was the last word he spoke clearly. Eli did not shout. He did not threaten. He exploded. He moved with a speed that was not human. He was not trying to scare them. He was not trying to warn them. He was trying to end them. He did not use the knife. His first blow, a fist driven by all his weight and rage, struck Henderson square in the chest. The sound was a wet, sickening thud. Henderson gasped, his eyes wide, and collapsed, gagging. Silas, stunned, went for his gun. Eli was already moving. He grabbed Silas by the front of his coat, lifted him off his feet, and threw him backward. Silas's head hit the solid stone of the hearth with a sound like a melon splitting. He did not move. Jed, his face a mask of terror, finally cleared his pistol from its holster. He raised it, his hands shaking. Eli grabbed the barrel, forcing it up. The gun went off. A deafening blast that filled the cabin with smoke. The bullet tore through the roof. Eli twisted the gun from Jed's grip and struck him across the face with it. Jed screamed, clutching his broken nose, and fell to his knees. It was over in 5 seconds. The cabin was silent, filled with the sharp smell of gunpowder and the ragged sound of Eli's breathing. Silas was unconscious. Jed was kneeling, blood pouring from his face. Henderson was on the ground by the door, clutching his chest, a dark stain of blood on the snow from where he had coughed. Eli stood in the center of the room, his chest heaving, his fists clenched. He looked at Henderson, who was trying to crawl away. He took a step toward him. He was going to finish it. He was going to kill him. His face was no longer human. It was an ancestral mask of pure, cold rage.
Eli, no!
Clara's scream cut through the smoke. He stopped.
Eli, please,
She begged, tears streaming down her face.
don't kill him. Please, not for me. Don't.
He stood there, trembling, balanced on the knife edge between man and weapon. He looked at his hands. They were bloody. He looked at the men on the floor. He looked at Clara, her face a ruin of terror. The rage drained out of him, leaving something worse, a hollow, sick cold. He looked at Jed.
Get them,
He whispered, his voice hoarse.
get them out.
Jed, sobbing, scrambled to his feet. He grabbed the unconscious Silas by the armpits and began to drag him out the door.
Help me, Mr. Henderson.
Henderson, gasping, used the door frame to pull himself to his feet. He clutched his chest, his eyes wide with terror and hatred for Eli. He stumbled out into the night. Jed came back, grabbed the pistol, and fled, dragging Silas into the darkness. The door was wide open. The wind blew snow into the cabin. Eli did not move. He stood in the middle of the room, staring at his own hands. They were shaking, a violent, uncontrollable tremor. He made a sound, a low, choked noise in the back of his throat.
He was devastated. It was not shame, it was fear.
They were right. Mrs. Gable, Henderson, Jed, Silas, his father. They were all right. He was not a man. He was a thing, a weapon, a savage, capable only of violence. He had almost killed them. He had wanted to kill them. He had proven them right. He collapsed. He did not fall. He slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, his head bowed, his body racked by dry, silent sobs of despair. Clara stared at him for a moment, her own fear forgotten. She saw his pain. It was a wound deeper than any the ranchers could have given him. She walked to him, her legs shaking. She knelt in front of him. He flinched as she reached out, as if expecting a blow. She pushed the long, black hair away from his face. His eyes were closed, his face wet with tears. She put her arms around him, pulling his head toward her. She held him, his big, trembling body pressed against her, his face buried in her shoulder. She held him tightly, rocking him, as she had once rocked Mateo. He wept, not for the men or the fight, but for himself.
"You're not what they say,"
she murmured, her own tears falling into his hair.
You are not a weapon. You protected me.
You are a good man." She held him, and he let her. He clung to her, a broken man in a cold, dark cabin, as the wind howled outside. The rumors found their way out of town faster than a prairie fire. Jed and Silas, their faces stitched and bruised, had staggered back to the Silver Spurs saloon, trailing Henderson, who was spitting blood and clutching his ribs. Their story was one of righteous men attacked by a savage. They claimed they had gone to retrieve stolen property, only to be met with the unholy violence of the half-breed. Inflamed, they said, by the wicked woman he was keeping. The town, already primed by Mrs. Gable's judgment, seized on the tale. It was proof. The woman was a contaminant. The man was a rabid dog. They had brought violence to the town's very doorstep. Eli and Clara did not know the details, but they knew what was coming. They had spent the day after the attack in the strained, charged silence of their cabin. Clara had cleaned the blood from the floorboards, her hands steady. Eli had sat by the hearth, sharpening his knife, over and over. The sound of the whetstone, a long, rhythmic shying of controlled rage. He was no longer weeping. He was coiled, a predator forced back into his den, waiting. They were low on flour. The attack had proven they were not safe, but survival still demanded supplies. "I will go," Eli said.
"No,"
Clara said, her voice quiet.
"We will go."
He stopped sharpening.
"They want you. It is not safe."
"They want us," she corrected, meeting his gaze.
"They hate you. And they hate me for being with you. Hiding here will not change it. I will not hide."
He saw the new steel in her eyes. It was the same will that had brought her back to his cabin in the dark. He nodded. Once. They rode into Redemption Gap in the cold light of midday. The snow was melting, turning the street into a thick, clinging mud that pulled at the horses' hooves. The town went silent. It was not the loud, jeering scorn of the saloon. It was a dead, cold silence. The blacksmith stopped his hammer. Women on the boardwalk gathered their skirts and hurried inside, pulling their children with them. Men standing outside the mercantile just stared, their faces hard and flat. The entire town seemed to hold its breath. Eli kept the horse at a slow walk, his eyes scanning every window, every alley. He was rigid, his hand resting on his thigh, inches from his knife. Clara sat behind him, her back straight, her hands clutching his waist. She refused to lower her gaze. They stopped in front of the mercantile. Before Eli could dismount, a man stepped out into the street, blocking their path. It was Reverend Josiah Miller. He was a tall, thin man with a face like a hatchet and eyes that burned with a cold, righteous fire. He was followed by Murchison and Mr. Halloway from the hotel, who flanked him like grim disciples. "Clara Whitmore," the preacher's voice rang out, sharp and loud, meant to carry.
Eli's hand went to his knife. "Do not,"
Clara whispered, her fingers digging into his side. The Reverend advanced, stopping a few feet from the horse. He did not look at Eli. He looked only at Clara, his face a mask of judgment. "The good people of this town have met, woman. We have spoken with the circuit judge. We have voted. You are a blight, a source of sin and discord." Clara said nothing, her face pale. "You came here under false pretenses," he accused, his voice rising. "You lived a life of shame, and when cast out, you fled to the wilderness to live in sin with a heathen." Eli's breath hitched. He began to dismount.
"Stay on the horse, Eli,"
Clara commanded, her voice low and fierce. He froze, caught between her order and his rage. The preacher saw the movement. He smiled, a thin, cruel turning of his lips. "You see, you have become a temptress of the savage. You have inflamed his dark nature. You have brought his violence upon decent men who sought only to uphold the law."
"They lied,"
Clara said, her voice shaking but clear.
"They attacked us."
"Silence," the Reverend roared. "You will not speak your poison here. The town council has voted. You are banished. You have until sunset tomorrow to be beyond the county line. If you are found hereafter, you will be arrested and sent to the territorial prison." He pointed a long, bony finger at her. "You are not welcome among civilized folk. Go back to the wilderness you have chosen." He then, for the first time, looked at Eli. His eyes were filled with a mixture of fear and pure contempt. "As for you, Blackthorn, we know what you are. This town has tolerated your presence, but if you bring your violence here again, we will form a posse, and we will hunt you down. This is your only warning." Reverend Miller turned, his black coat swirling, and marched back to the boardwalk, his duty done. The small crowd of onlookers stared, their faces agreeing with every word. Eli yanked the horse's reins, turning it so hard the animal reared. He did not wait for supplies. He dug his heels into its flanks, and the horse lunged forward, churning through the mud, galloping out of the town that had just excommunicated them. He did not stop until they were deep in the canyon, the town a hateful memory far behind them. He slid from the saddle, his body shaking with a rage so profound he could not speak. He paced back and forth in the snow, his hands clenching and unclenching. "They will pay," he whispered. "They will not."
"They have done it,"
Clara said, her voice hollow. She was still sitting on the horse, her body slumped. Eli stopped pacing. He looked up at her. "We leave. Tonight. We ride north, into the high mountains. I know places, caves, valleys. They will never find us.
We can hunt. We can survive. He began to untie his bedroll, his movements jerky, desperate. He was ready to flee, to disappear. No. He stopped, his hand frozen on a knot.
What?
No, Clara said again, sliding off the horse. Her legs were weak, but she stood tall.
I am not running.
Clara, you heard him. They will hunt us. They will put you in prison. They will kill me. This is not a choice.
It is always a choice, she said, walking toward him. I am tired of running. Eli, I ran from my home in Kansas because I loved a man they told me not to. I ran from my husband's grave because I was alone. I ran from the saloon because I was shamed. I ran here, to you, because I had nowhere else to go. She stopped in front of him, close enough to touch. This cabin, this small, broken-down place. This is the first home I have had since I buried my son. You are the first person who has ever looked at me and not seen something broken. And I will not be run off. I will not. He stared at her, his mind unable to comprehend.
You would stay and let them come?
They will come with rifles, not with words.
Then they will come,
she said, her voice raw. They called me a savage, he spat, the word tasting like ash. A weapon. And they were right. You saw what I did. I almost killed them. I wanted to kill them. How can you stand here? Because they are wrong, she said, her eyes fierce. You are not a savage. You are a man who has been hurt. You are a man who protected me, who protected us. He shook his head, turning away from her. He paced to the creek bed. His hands knotted in his hair. He could not find air. He kept touching the heavy brass buckle of his belt. It was his anchor, the cold, familiar weight. Clara watched him. She watched his hand go to the belt, a reflexive, unconscious gesture of self-preservation. She walked to him, her boots sinking into the mud. That is what you believe, she said quietly. He stopped, his back to her. You believe them. You believe what they say. You believe what your father told you. She was standing right behind him now. That is why you wear it, is not it? He went rigid. You wear his belt, she whispered, her voice aching with a truth she had only just grasped. The man who hated you, the man who threw you out, you wear his judgment every day. You have punished yourself for him, for them, for 20 years. You have punished yourself enough, Eli. He turned, his face a mask of pain. You do not understand. I understand that you survived, she said, her hands trembling as she lifted them. You survived them all, and you do not need to wear their ghost anymore. She reached for the belt. The evening light was fading. They were back in the cabin. The fire was lit, casting a low, trembling light. The unresolved tension was a third person in the room. Eli stood by the hearth, trapped. He had not agreed to stay. He had not agreed to anything. He was just waiting. Clara had not pressed him, but now, she stood up from the stool. She walked to him, stepping into the space between him and the fire. He was so tall, she had to look up. His face was in shadow, but she could see the fear in his eyes. He was not afraid of her. He was afraid of this. Her hand, shaking, lifted. She was going to touch it. The buckle. Clara, do not. His voice was a choked rasp. She did not stop. She had to, for both of them. It is just leather now, Eli, she whispered. It is a thing. It does not own you. Not anymore. Her fingers brushed the cold brass. He grabbed her wrist. His grip was not gentle. It was like an iron trap. His fingers clamped down, stopping her instantly. It was a desperate, reflexive action. Do not touch the wound. His eyes were wide, panicked. He was the boy in the reeds. He was the boy on the porch. He was the boy in the dirt. Clara did not flinch. She did not pull away. She did not fight him. She just looked at him. Her eyes, soft in the firelight, held his. They were not filled with pity or desire. They were filled with acceptance. She saw his panic, and she was not afraid of it. She just waited. His grip was so tight, her fingers were going numb. He was breathing, harsh, short breaths. He stared at her, seeing her steadiness, her refusal to be scared away by his own brokenness. Slowly, so slowly. His fingers trembled. The iron grip loosened. It became a clasp. Then, it was just his hand, holding hers, and then he let her go. He closed his eyes, his head bowing in a silent, agonizing surrender. He was giving her permission. He was trusting her with the anchor of his pain. Clara's hand was free. She took a shaky breath. Her fingers, now free, went back to the buckle. It was heavy, the brass worn smooth in some places, green with verdigris in others. She fumbled with the clasp, her own hands trembling. The metal scritched as she worked the pin free. It came undone. She hesitated, then gripped the end of the heavy leather strap. She began to pull. It was a long belt, thick and stiff. It rasped as it came free from the first loop, then the second. Eli stood absolutely still, his eyes closed, his face pale. He was vibrating. A wire pulled too tight. She pulled the last of it free. The belt was heavy in her hands. She let it go. It hit the packed dirt floor with a heavy, final thud. The sound of it was absolute. A weight. Gone. Eli opened his eyes. He looked down at the belt, coiled on the floor like a dead snake. He looked at his own waist, at his untucked, rough-spun shirt. He took a breath. It was a deep, ragged, shuddering gasp. The first full breath he had taken in 20 years. He looked lighter. He looked lost. Clara stepped closer. The belt was gone, but the memories were not. She could see them on his skin. She gently, with one hand, lifted the side of his shirt. He let her, there, on his side, pale and white against his darker skin, were the scars, thin, silvery lines, the map of his past, the brands the ranchers had left on him. She looked at the scars, then at his face. His eyes were wet. She leaned in. She did not kiss his lips. She pressed her mouth, softly, reverently, to the widest, ugliest scar on his side. It was a kiss that said, "I see this. I accept this. This is part of you, but it is not all of you." A sound broke from him. A low, wounded sound, half groan, half sob. His arms came around her, pulling her against him with a desperate strength. He buried his face in her hair, his big body shaking. He was not weeping with grief. It was the terrifying, agonizing release of a man who had just been set free and had no idea how to stand. Clara held him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, her hands pressing against his strong back, and just held him. They stood by the fire, wordless, trembling, both of them deeply afraid, and both of them, for the first time in their lives, deeply and completely seen. That night, they laid their furs side by side on the floor, close. Eli lay on his back, staring at the dark ceiling. He felt naked, unprotected. His hand kept twitching, moving to the empty place at his waist. But the dreams did not come. The blue-coated soldiers did not ride. His father's door did not slam shut for the first time since he was a boy. He slept. It was a deep, heavy, dreamless sleep. He woke before dawn. He felt a profound lightness. He turned his head. Clara was asleep beside him, her face soft in the gray light, her hand resting on the fur near his shoulder. He looked at her for a long time. He looked at the coiled belt, still lying on the floor. Quietly, he rose. He put on his coat and boots and went outside. The air was cold, but the threat of deep winter was gone. The ground was soft, thawing. He could smell the promise of spring under the mud. He looked at the cabin, their home. He looked at the small, dead patch of ground beside it, where Clara had dreamed of planting. He picked up his axe. He walked past his horse, past his traps. He walked to the edge of the small clearing and began to work. He did not scout. He did not hunt. He began to build. He found strong, straight deadfall pine. He swung the axe, the rhythmic thunk echoing in the silent canyon. He split rails. He sweated, the cold air stinging his bare chest as he stripped off his coat. Then his shirt. He dug post holes, his muscles straining against the rocky, half-frozen earth. Clara woke to the sound. She came to the door, wrapped in a blanket. She saw him. His back was corded with muscle, steam rising from his skin in the cold air. He was covered in mud and sweat. He was setting a heavy post deep into the ground. He was building a fence. It was not a fence to keep attackers out. It was a low, simple fence, enclosing the small patch of land by the cabin. It was a gesture of permanence. It was a fence to hold a garden. It was his answer. He was not running. He was staying. He was claiming this land, this life, with her. She watched him, her heart so full she could barely breathe. A week passed. The fence was half finished. They had settled into a new, quiet rhythm. They worked together. They talked. Their conversations still quiet, but no longer haunted. They waited. The town did not come. The banishment was a heavy cloud, but it stayed on the horizon. Then a rider. It was not the Reverend. It was a young man, barely more than a boy, on a lean painted pony. He was Apache. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, his eyes wary. Eli went out to meet him, his hands open, palms out. The young man spoke, his voice low, in the Apache tongue. Eli's face was a mask of confusion, then shock. The rider handed him a small, folded piece of tanned hide, beaded with a single blue feather. The rider left as silently as he had come. Eli walked back to the cabin, staring at the message. "What is it?" Clara asked. He looked up, his eyes wide, lost. "It is from my mother's brother, an uncle I have never met. His name is Je." "How did he find you?" "The boy. He said they have watched me. For years. They knew of the white rancher's son. They watched." He unlaced the hide. He says my mother's spirit is unavenged. He invites me to a gathering in the Dragoon Mountains, a spring gathering of the people. He was torn. He looked at Clara, then at the half-built fence, then at the town. He was Apache. He was white. He was neither, and he could not leave her. "The town," he began. "I cannot leave you alone." Clara went to him. She took the hide message from his hands. She looked at the strange, beautiful markings. "Eli," she said, her voice firm, "you must go." He stared at her, stunned. "Go! Clara, they will—" "I will be fine," she said, putting her hands on his chest. "The fence is here. I have your rifle. I am not the woman who stumbled into that saloon. They cast me out. Eli, I have nothing left to lose from them. But you have everything to gain." She touched the single, faded braid in his hair. "Your father took this from you. He tried to kill this part of you. Go and see your mother's people. Reclaim what was never your fault to lose. Find out who you are." He looked at her, his heart aching. The next morning, he prepared. He packed jerky, his bedroll, his knife, his rifle. He left for her. He stood by his horse. Clara was beside him, her hand on the horse's neck. He was terrified, terrified to leave her, terrified to go. He turned, grabbing her by the shoulders. He looked down at her face, memorizing it. He leaned down and kissed her. It was not a soft kiss. It was clumsy, hard, chapped. It was the first kiss of his life. It was full of desperation and a raw, aching promise. It was a kiss that said, "I will die before I let you go, and I am terrified I will never return." He pulled back, his breath ragged. "I will return," he said. It was a vow. "I know," she whispered. He swung himself into the saddle. He looked at her one last time, standing by the new fence, a small, strong figure against the vast wilderness. He turned his horse, not toward the town, but south, toward the high, blue mountains. The first week was the longest. Clara finished the fence he had started, her hands blistering, the axe handle heavy and awkward in her grip. She found his rifle, checked its load, and practiced shooting at a knot on a distant pine. The first shot, a deafening blast that echoed down the canyon, nearly knocked her from her feet. The second was steadier. She learned to reload, her fingers fumbling. Then, finding a rhythm, she was not a victim. She would not be. The day of the banishment, sunset, came and went. She stood in the cabin doorway, the loaded rifle in her hands, watching the shadows stretch and bleed into the canyon. She waited for the Reverend, for Henderson, for the sound of horses. No one came. The town, it seemed, was brave enough to pass judgment, but too cowardly to enforce it on a woman they believed was protected by a savage. Or perhaps they just did not care enough to climb the ridge. She was alone, truly alone, for the first time, in a place she had claimed. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a sharper, hotter ache, the fear for him. She did not know his uncle. She did not know the Apache. She only knew the stories the white men told. She prayed, not to the Reverend's God, but to the vast, silent sky, that they were not true. She worked. She cleared the small patch of land inside the new fence. She dug her fingers into the cold, damp earth, pulling rocks, breaking up the soil. She was preparing a garden. Though she had no seeds to plant, she hunted. She missed more rabbits than she hit, but she brought down 2, skinning them with his knife. The process clumsy and grim, but necessary. She kept the cabin clean. She kept the fire lit. She waited. It was 3 weeks, 3 weeks and 2 days. She was splitting kindling, the axe feeling lighter now, more familiar, when she heard it, a horse. Not the shuffling step of a lost cow, but the steady, sure gait of a rider. She dropped the axe and ran for the rifle. She stood just inside the door, her heart hammering, the heavy barrel resting on the doorframe. He came out of the pines, not on his shaggy pony, but on a strong bay gelding. He was not alone. He was leading a second horse, a gentle-looking paint mare with a rope hackamore. Clara let the rifle barrel lower. She did not run to him. She just stood, her knuckles white on the gun, her breath caught in her throat. He rode into the clearing and stopped. He was different. The outline said it. He was darker. His skin burned a deep, rich brown by a sun she had not seen. He was thinner, perhaps, but harder, the lines of his face clearer. He wore the same canvas trousers, but his shirt was different, simpler, and the hunted look in his eyes. It was gone. It was replaced by a stillness, a calm so profound it seemed to emanate from him, like heat from a stone. He sat taller in the saddle, not with pride, but with the simple fact of belonging to the world. He slid from the horse. He did not speak. He just looked at her, his dark eyes taking in the rifle in her hands, the sweat on her brow, the wood she had chopped. He looked past her, at the finished fence, at the neatly turned soil of the garden. He saw what she had done. His gaze returned to her face. He saw the fear, the relief, the exhaustion. He turned to his saddle pack. He untied a heavy, folded bundle. He walked toward her, his steps measured, silent. He stopped in front of her. He held up the bundle. It was a shawl, thick and heavy, woven from dark wool. The colors were of the earth, deep red, charcoal black, and a startling, bright line of turquoise blue. It smelled of wood smoke and sage. "For you," he said. His voice was the same, but the rasp was gone, as if he had spent weeks speaking. He did not hand it to her. He unfolded it, lifted it, and settled it over her shoulders. The weight of it was a comfort, an embrace. It was an act of protection, of honor. Clara's hands came up, her fingers sinking into the thick wool. Tears she had refused to shed for 3 weeks suddenly burned, hot and fast. "Eli," she whispered, the name a prayer. He reached into his pack again and brought out a small, soft pouch made of deer hide. He opened it. Inside were seeds, dark, polished corn, pale squash seeds, and mottled beans. "From the mountains," he said. "They are strong." He held the pouch out. She took it, her hands trembling. These were the seeds for her garden. He had brought her the future. She looked up at him, unable to speak. "I brought you the mare," he said, nodding toward the paint horse. "She is quiet. She is yours." She had never owned anything, a satchel, a worn-out dress. Now, a shawl, a horse, and a garden. She did not thank him. The words were too small. She stepped forward, ignoring the rifle she still held, and put her arms around his waist, pressing her face into the rough cotton of his shirt. He was stiff, surprised, for only a second. Then his arms came around her, pulling her tight. He held her, his hand pressing the back of her head, his chin resting on her hair. He held her as he had in the cabin, but this was not the desperate cling of a broken man. This was the sure, solid embrace of a man who had come home. They planted the garden together. The next morning, they knelt in the rich, dark earth, side by side. Clara had the small store of seeds she had found in his cabin, his mother's seeds. Eli had the new seeds from his uncle. They mixed them together. They worked in a comfortable silence, her pale, chapped hands moving next to his scarred, brown ones. They pushed the seeds deep into the soil, corn, beans, and squash, his heritage and hers, planted in the same dirt. As they worked, he spoke, not in a rush, but in short, quiet sentences, as if recounting a simple trip. He told her of the mountains, so high the air was thin and cold. He told her of meeting Jew, his uncle, a hard man with eyes that saw everything. He told her how they had sat by a fire. "He did not see white," Eli said, patting the soil over a bean. "He looked at me. He said my mother's name, Ishkene. He said I had her eyes." Clara paused, her hand deep in the dirt. "They called me Shikise," Eli murmured. "My brother, the Reverend, he called me a heathen. They called me brother." He told her they had taught him things. How to find water where there was none. How to read the stars as a map. He had hunted with them. He had sat in their councils. He had learned. He said that his mother had not been a camp follower, as the ranchers whispered. She had been a warrior, a woman of great strength, stolen in a raid she had fought to the last. He had not been avenged, his uncle said, because he was not lost. He was, finally, found. Clara watched his face as he spoke. He was the same man, but he was whole. The war inside him, the one between the white man who had rejected him and the Apache he had never known, was over. He had not chosen a side. He had simply chosen to be himself. In the weeks that followed, they rebuilt the cabin. They mixed new adobe, using mud and straw, and plastered the failing walls until they were solid and strong. He used his axe to cut timber for a real porch, a place to sit and watch the canyon. He built a new, solid door. They carved a life, half Apache, half white, and all theirs. They had to go to town. The flour was gone, and the coffee. This time they rode in on their separate horses, side by side. Clara wore her new shawl. Eli sat straight, his gaze calm. They were not two outcasts, one hiding behind the other. They were a man and a woman, riding into town for supplies. The town remained cold. Reverend Miller saw them from the church steps and turned his back. A deliberate, public snub, Mrs. Gable, sweeping the boardwalk in front of the soup kitchen, stopped, glared, and then began to sweep with a furious, agitated motion, raising a cloud of dust. But some things had changed. Eli waited with the horses while Clara, her head high, walked into the mercantile. "Mister, Holloway was there, behind the counter. He looked at her, his eyes moving to Eli outside, and his face tightened. "What do you want?" he said, his voice clipped. "Flour," Clara said, her voice clear. "And salt, and coffee." He slapped the bags on the counter. Clara paid with the money she had earned from the pelts of the rabbits she had trapped. She did not flinch. She took her goods and walked out. As they were tying the bags to the saddles, a small boy, no older than 6, crept out from the blacksmith's shop. He was dirty, his face smudged, his eyes wide with curiosity. It was Tommy, the blacksmith's son. He was staring at Clara's shawl. "That's pretty," he whispered, pointing. Clara stopped. She looked at the boy. Eli tensed, his hand moving toward his knife. Clara put a hand on his arm. "Thank you," Clara said to the boy. "My husband gave it to me." She said the word husband clearly. It was a claim. The boy's mother, Beth, a thin, tired-looking woman, ran out. "Tommy, get back here! Do not bother them!" She grabbed the boy's arm, her face a mixture of fear and defiance. Clara reached into one of the bags. She had baked that morning a small loaf of sweet cornbread. She broke off a piece. "He is not bothering me," Clara said. She knelt, holding the cornbread out to the boy. "Are you hungry?" Tommy looked at his mother. Beth's face was a war of prejudice and politeness. She hated what Clara represented, but she was a mother, and her boy was being offered food. "Go on," Beth muttered, letting go of his arm. The boy darted forward, snatched the cornbread, and ran back to his mother's skirts, stuffing it into his mouth. Clara broke off another, larger piece. She held it out to the woman. "For you!" Beth stared at the cornbread. She looked at Clara's face. She saw no wickedness, no sin. She saw a woman, like her, trying to survive. She slowly reached out and took the bread. "Thank you, ma'am," she whispered. She did not meet Clara's eyes, but she did not throw the bread away. She turned, pulling her son, and went back into the smithy. It was not forgiveness, it was not acceptance, but it was a beginning, a small softening. That night, the cabin was warm. The new porch was finished, but the air was still too crisp to sit outside. A fire burned low in the hearth. The smell of bean soup was thick in the air. Clara sat on a stool, a small, worn book open in her lap. It was the only thing, besides her clothes, that she had carried in her satchel. She was reading aloud, her voice soft, the story a simple one of a family in a faraway place. Eli sat on the floor, his back against the wall, his eyes closed. He was not sleeping. He was listening. He was resting. In all his life, he had never known this. He had never known peace. He opened his eyes and watched her. Her face was lit by the fire. The lines of worry and exhaustion softened. The blue thread in her shawl seemed to glow. He rose, his movements silent. He came up behind her. She stopped reading, sensing him there. He placed his hands on her shoulders. She leaned back against his legs. He slid his arms around her waist, pulling her back against him. He was warm, solid. He rested his chin on the top of her hair, breathing in her scent. "I didn't know I could want this," he whispered. His voice was thick with a profound, startled wonder. He did not mean the cabin or the food. He meant the quiet, the reading, the simple, solid presence of her, safe in his arms. Clara smiled. She reached up, covering his scarred hands with her own. She tilted her head, leaning it against his chest. "You always did," she replied, her voice just as soft. "You just didn't believe you deserved it." He held her, and they were silent, listening to the fire. The seasons turned. The garden grew, and they harvested the corn and squash. The winter came again. It was not the biting, desperate cold of the year before. It was a quiet, expected cold. The first snow of the season began to fall. Not a blizzard, but a soft, gentle drift of white flakes, muffling the world, making the canyon quiet. They sat on the porch, wrapped together in the heavy buffalo hide. They did not speak, just watched the snow stack up on the new railing. Clara's gaze drifted to the wall beside the door. It was hanging there, on a wooden peg he had put up, his father's belt. It was not worn, it was not thrown away, it was not hidden, it was just there, a coiled piece of dark, cracked leather. The brass buckle was dull in the gray afternoon light. It was a memory, a relic, an old piece of leather that no longer had any power. It was his past, acknowledged, but no longer on him. Eli saw her looking at it. He said nothing. He just took her hand, the one that was resting on his knee, and laced his fingers through hers. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He leaned his against hers. Their love, quiet, hard-earned, and real, stood against the wildness of the world, against the cold judgment of the town and the ghosts of their past. It stood like a small, enduring flame, burning brightly in the dark. Thank you for listening to this story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so you can connect with other fans. We invite you to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.